the weight of severed wire. The detonation cord lay severed in the mud like a broken promise, its copper wire gleaming dully against the Norman earth. Staff Sergeant Jake McNiece crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, fingering the frayed ends, while German voices drifted across the flooded fields. 3 hours until sunrise, 3 hours before the panzer column would cross the stone bridge at Pont du Phare, the bridge he was supposed to have destroyed by midnight. The Normandy drop had scattered the filthy 13 across 2 miles of hedgerow country, turning a precise demolition mission into a nightmare of improvisation. McNiece pressed his back against the cold stone of a bombed farmhouse, watching enemy patrol boats splash through puddles 50 yards away. The TNT satchel beside him was soaked through, its canvas dark with marsh water from his hard landing. Half the blasting caps had scattered when he hit the ground, lost somewhere in the maze of flooded ditches that crisscrossed this corner of occupied France. Radio contact was dead. The carefully rehearsed plan, coordinated charges, precise timing, clean withdrawal, existed only in the waterlogged field manual stuffed in his jacket pocket. Reality was this: 1 demolition NCO with damaged explosives, a severed detonation cord, and the growing certainty that following regulations would get everyone killed. "Sarge," Private Tommy Riggs whispered from the shadow of a collapsed barn wall. "You see 'em?" McNiece nodded toward the German patrol moving east along the hedge line. The kid was 19, from some Ohio farm town, still believing that training manuals covered situations like this. Riggs had thrown up twice during the flight over, hands shaking as he checked his gear for the 5th time. Now he was looking at McNiece, like the sergeant had answers written in the mud. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. McNiece was making it up as he went, same as always. The army had taught him to blow things up by the book. Combat had taught him that books burned just as easily as bridges, and what mattered was reading the ground, the enemy, and the look in his men's eyes when they realized the plan had gone to hell. He gathered the remaining explosives with methodical precision. 2 intact TNT blocks, a handful of primer caps in a dented cigarette tin, and 15 feet of backup fuse that burned too fast for anything resembling safety. The severed detonation cord mocked him from the mud, victim of the same artillery burst that had sent Sergeant Collins tumbling into a drainage ditch with a dislocated shoulder. Lieutenant Morrison's voice echoed in his memory from the pre-mission briefing. "Simple demolition, McNiece. Plant the charges, blow the bridge, deny the crossing to enemy armor. By the numbers, by the numbers." McNiece almost laughed, tasting blood from a split lip earned during his landing. The numbers said he needed 50 feet of detonation cord to reach safe distance from the blast. The numbers said the bridge's central span required 4 charges, not 2. The numbers said a lot of things that didn't account for scattered drops, damaged equipment, and German patrols moving faster than intelligence had predicted. The bridge lay 300 yards across open ground, a simple stone and steel structure designed for supply trucks, not tanks. But it was solid, positioned over the one dry crossing for miles in any direction. German engineers were already setting up defensive positions on the far side, voices carrying across the water in clipped, efficient syllables. McNiece wrapped the broken detonation cord around his wrist like a bracelet, a reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same cord that should have fired the charges now served as improvised rope, securing what remained of his gear. "What's the plan, Sarge?" Riggs asked, eyes reflecting the distant flicker of artillery flashes. McNiece looked at the kid, then at the scattered remnants of his demolition kit. The plan was simple enough to explain, impossible enough to survive. But that had never stopped him before. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The approach to the canal bridge required crossing 200 yards of Norman hedgerow country in the grey hour before dawn. McNiece moved in short sprints between stone walls and drainage ditches, the damaged TNT satchel heavy against his ribs. Each sound, a boot scraping wet stone, a branch snapping under weight, felt amplified in the June silence. Private Riggs followed 10 yards behind, moving with the awkward caution of someone still learning that survival meant constant calculation. Cover to cover, shadow to shadow, always listening for the mechanical click of a rifle bolt or the whispered German that meant discovery. The severed detonation cord around McNiece's wrist caught on a thorn branch, jerking him back to the reality of his situation. Without that cord, the demolition became a suicide run. He'd have to light the fuse manually and sprint for cover across open ground, hoping 15 feet of fast-burning cord gave him enough time to reach minimum safe distance. The mathematics were unforgiving. The bridge's central support beam stood 30 feet from the nearest cover, a low stone wall that might deflect shrapnel if he was lucky, or channel the blast if he wasn't. With the backup fuse burning at roughly 1 foot per second, he'd have 15 seconds to place the charges and reach safety. Not enough time, even for someone who'd been blowing things up since basic training. "Sarge," Riggs whispered, pressing himself against a moss-covered stone wall. Movement on the bridge. McNiece peered through a gap in the hedgerow. German silhouettes moved across the span, like shadows against the lighter sky, setting up what looked like a machine gun position on the far side. The enemy was fortifying the crossing, turning his target into a strong point. Every minute he waited made the job more dangerous, the enemy position stronger, but rushing forward with damaged equipment and insufficient explosives would accomplish nothing except adding his name to a casualty list. McNiece had seen enough of those lists to know they were written in the same neat handwriting that composed mission reports, reducing complex human disasters to clean administrative language. He thought about Lieutenant Morrison, probably bent over a map table somewhere behind the lines, wondering why the bridge at Pont du Phare still showed intact on reconnaissance photos. Morrison was a decent officer, promoted from the ranks, but he'd never had to jury-rig explosives in a flooded Norman field while listening to enemy voices grow closer. The broken detonation cord caught his attention again, copper wire gleaming in the faint light. McNiece had been carrying demolition gear since North Africa, had blown everything from railway bridges to bunker complexes, but he'd never felt the weight of failure quite like this. The Filthy 13 followed him because he got results through methods that made headquarters nervous and kept his men alive. This time felt different. This time, the gap between what the mission required and what he could deliver seemed too wide to bridge with improvisation and stubborn will. "What if we wait for the rest of the squad?" Riggs suggested, voice barely audible above the distant rumble of engines. "They'll be looking for us." McNiece almost smiled at the kid's optimism. The rest of the squad was scattered across 2 miles of enemy territory, probably dealing with their own collection of broken radios, damaged equipment, and impossible orders. In combat, you worked with what you had, not what you'd planned to have. He studied the bridge structure through the growing light. The central support beam was steel, designed to carry the weight of loaded supply trucks. Destroying it would require precise placement of charges, something best accomplished with proper detonation cord and adequate explosives. What he had was 2 TNT blocks, primer caps that might or might not fire reliably after their soaking, and a length of fuse that demanded split-second timing. The sound of tank tracks on distant cobblestones drifted across the fields, still miles away, but approaching with mechanical inevitability. The panzer column was ahead of schedule, moving faster than intelligence had predicted. McNiece had minutes, not hours, to decide between following procedures that couldn't work and improvising something that might kill him. He unwrapped the detonation cord from his wrist, studying the severed ends. The break was clean, caused by shrapnel rather than wear. With proper splicing gear, it might be possible to reconnect the sections, but proper splicing gear was probably scattered across a Norman field somewhere with the rest of his missing equipment. "Time to move," he told Riggs, shouldering the TNT satchel. The kid nodded, checking his rifle one more time before following McNiece toward the sound of enemy voices and the bridge that had to fall. The German machine gun position was taking shape on the far side of the bridge, sandbags and camouflage netting appearing with efficient precision. McNiece watched from a drainage ditch 50 yards from the near approach, counting enemy soldiers and calculating angles of fire. At least 6 men, possibly more, concealed in the morning shadows. The sound of approaching armor grew louder, tank tracks on stone, the deep rumble of diesel engines pushing 30 tons of steel toward the crossing. McNiece had maybe 20 minutes before the first panzer reached the bridge. After that, the stone span would become a highway for German counterattack, a direct route to American positions that weren't prepared for coordinated armor. Private Riggs lay beside him in the muddy water, rifle cradled against his chest. The kid had stopped asking questions, accepting with farm boy pragmatism that their situation had moved beyond normal solutions. He'd learned what most combat soldiers discovered eventually. Sometimes the choice wasn't between good options and bad ones, but between different varieties of disaster. McNiece fingered the severed detonation cord, turning over possibilities in his mind. The break was clean enough that he might be able to splice it using wire from his radio set, assuming the radio was as dead as it seemed. The repair would be crude, unreliable, but it might extend his firing distance enough to matter. "Sarge, movement behind us," Riggs whispered. McNiece turned to see American helmets bobbing through the hedgerows 200 yards back. Part of his scattered squad, probably, or paratroopers from another unit trying to link up after the chaotic drop. Relief and anxiety warred in his chest. Help was coming, but more men meant more people to coordinate, more chances for someone to get killed when things went wrong. The approaching soldiers moved with the careful haste of experienced infantry, using terrain features to mask their advance. McNiece recognized Sergeant Collins from Dog Company, arm hanging awkward in an improvised sling, followed by 3 paratroopers he didn't know. Collins had been scheduled to demolish a road bridge 2 miles south, which meant that mission had either succeeded or failed spectacularly. Collins dropped into the drainage ditch, wincing as the impact jarred his injured shoulder. Water seeped through his torn jump jacket, mixing mud with dried blood from a scalp wound. "Bridge is still standing," Collins observed, nodding toward the stone span. "Thought you'd have it down by now." "Equipment problems," McNiece replied, showing him the severed detonation cord. "You have any luck with your target?" "Blew it clean," Collins said with satisfaction. "But Jerry's moving faster than expected. Saw at least 2 tank columns heading this way. Your bridge goes down, or we're all swimming home." The weight of responsibility settled heavier on McNiece's shoulders. It wasn't just his squad now, or even his mission. Other units were counting on this crossing being denied, their survival tied to his ability to drop a stone bridge with insufficient explosives and damaged equipment. He studied the bridge structure again, noting the way morning light revealed stress points and structural joints. The central support was definitely steel, but the approach spans were stone and mortar, possibly more vulnerable to improvised demolition. If he placed the charges at the right points, used the backup fuse to create a sequence. "What's your explosive situation?" he asked Collins. "Used everything on the road bridge. Got some grenades, but nothing that'll touch this target." McNiece nodded, unsurprised. Demolition missions were planned with minimal excess, assuming everything would go according to schedule. Reality had a way of consuming explosives faster than planners anticipated, leaving field commanders to improvise with whatever remained. The broken detonation cord felt heavier in his hands, its severed copper wire catching the early sunlight. He'd carried similar cord on a dozen missions, trusted it to fire charges from safe distance, relied on its mechanical precision to turn calculated destruction into tactical advantage. Now it represented the gap between textbook demolition and the kind of desperate improvisation that kept men alive when plans failed. Sound of tank tracks grew closer, echoing off stone walls and hedgerows with mechanical persistence. Somewhere behind the German lines, a panzer commander was studying maps and calculating approach routes, expecting to find the bridge at Pont-de-Fars intact and ready for crossing. McNiece had carried enough responsibility to know that expectations often mattered more than reality in military operations. Headquarters expected the bridge to fall. German armor expected it to stand. His men expected him to figure out how to reconcile those contradictory expectations without getting everyone killed. The severed cord offered no answers, but it reminded him that improvisation had limits. Sometimes the distance between what you needed and what you had couldn't be bridged by ingenuity and stubborn will. Sometimes you had to choose between following procedures that couldn't work and trying something that might kill you. But first, he had to splice 20 feet of copper wire using field expedients and hope the connection held long enough to matter. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The radio wire proved too thin for reliable splicing, but McNiece found what he needed in the wreckage of a German supply cart abandoned near the bridge approach. Communication cable, thicker than his broken detonation cord, but compatible enough to bridge the gap with careful field splicing. Working in the shadow of a stone wall while Collins's men provided security, McNiece stripped insulation with his bayonet and twisted copper strands, together with the methodical precision of someone who understood that sloppy work meant dead paratroopers. The repair was crude but functional, extending his firing distance from 15 feet to nearly 40, still closer than regulations recommended, but far enough to give him a chance. The first panzer appeared on the road leading to the bridge, its angular silhouette unmistakable against the Norman countryside. More tanks followed, a column of German armor moving with mechanical confidence toward what they assumed would be an intact crossing. "Jesus," Riggs whispered. "How many of them are there?" McNiece counted at least 6 tanks, probably more concealed by trees and buildings. Enough armor to punch through American defensive positions, roll up the scattered airborne units, and threaten the entire beachhead operation. The bridge at Pont-de-Fars had become the fulcrum on which the invasion might turn. He secured the TNT blocks against the bridge's central support beam, using the severed detonation cord, now spliced and extended, to position the charges for maximum structural damage. The primer caps seated with reassuring clicks, their mechanical precision a small comfort amid the improvisation. Collins appeared beside him, moving awkwardly with his injured arm. "How long on the fuse?" 30 seconds if it burns true," McNiece replied, checking the splice connection one more time. "Might be less, might be more. Hard to predict with field repairs. That's cutting it close, even for you." McNiece almost smiled. Collins had been present for some of the Filthy 13's more creative demolitions, operations that headquarters classified as successful while quietly hoping they'd never be repeated. This felt different, though. Less like calculated risk and more like controlled disaster. The lead panzer was 200 yards from the bridge now, its commander probably studying the crossing through field glasses, checking for signs of American presence or prepared demolitions. McNiece wondered what the Germans saw, a quiet Norman bridge in early morning light, seemingly peaceful, apparently secure. He positioned himself behind the stone wall that marked minimum safe distance for the blast. 40 feet from the charges, protected by 18 inches of cut stone, gambling that his spliced detonation cord would hold long enough to fire the primers. If the splice failed, he'd have to run forward and light the backup fuse manually, a decision that would probably make him the shortest-lived demolition NCO in airborne history. "All set, Sarge?" Riggs called from his position 20 yards back. McNiece nodded, though set was relative when everything depended on improvised connections and backup equipment. He checked the firing circuit one final time, ensuring the spliced wire made solid contact with the primer assembly. The mathematics of demolition were unforgiving. Too much explosive wasted material, too little left the target intact, and bad timing got everyone killed. The lead tank was 50 yards from the bridge approach when McNiece triggered the firing circuit. For a long moment, probably less than a second, but feeling like minutes, nothing happened. Then the TNT blocks erupted with a sound like the world breaking apart. The blast was a physical punch that knocked the wind from his lungs and sent stone fragments whistling overhead. The bridge's central span buckled, twisted, and collapsed into the canal with a grinding crash that echoed across the Norman countryside. Steel beams jutted from the water at impossible angles, twisted into sculptural wreckage by explosive force. When the smoke cleared, the crossing at Pont du Phare existed only as rubble and memory. The German column had stopped short of the approach, tank commanders probably studying their maps and cursing the intelligence reports that had described the bridge as intact. McNiece examined his spliced detonation cord, still connected and functional despite the improvised repair. The severed wire that had threatened mission failure had become the tool that made success possible, demonstrating once again that combat engineering was mostly improvisation disguised as technical precision. Collins appeared through the clearing smoke, grinning despite his injured arm. "Nice work, McNiece. Think that'll hold them?" McNiece studied the wreckage choking the canal. "They're not crossing here. Not today, anyway." The sound of tank tracks was changing direction now, German armor seeking alternate routes that would delay their advance by hours or days. Hours that American forces could use to consolidate positions, reinforce weak points, and prepare for the counterattacks that would inevitably come. But first, they had to extract from a position that was about to receive more German attention than anyone wanted to experience firsthand. 3 hours after the bridge fell, McNiece sat in the ruins of a Norman farmhouse, cleaning mud from his gear while American artillery thundered in the distance. The spliced detonation cord lay coiled on a wooden crate beside him, its crude repair clearly visible in the afternoon light filtering through blown-out windows. Private Riggs was asleep against a stone wall, exhausted by the combination of combat adrenaline and physical strain that marked every airborne operation. The kid had performed well under pressure, following orders without question, even when the orders stopped making sense. McNiece envied that kind of trust, the certainty that someone else was handling the big decisions. The truth was messier than what would appear in after-action reports. The bridge demolition at Pont du Phare had succeeded, but not because of superior planning or technical precision. It had worked because of field splicing, improvised equipment, and the kind of desperate calculation that turned demolition experts into gambling addicts. Lieutenant Morrison appeared through the farmhouse doorway, uniform torn and muddy from his own morning adventures. He carried a field message pad and the expression of an officer trying to make sense of scattered reports from scattered units. "Good work on the bridge, McNiece," Morrison said, settling onto an upturned ammunition box. "Division wants a full report on the demolition sequence." McNiece almost laughed. The demolition sequence had been 30 seconds of controlled chaos, preceded by hours of improvisation and field repair. The official version would probably describe precise charge placement and textbook execution, reducing the reality to clean technical language. "Standard procedure," he replied. "Charges placed according to manual specifications, fired by electrical detonation." Morrison made notes with mechanical precision, translating McNiece's words into the kind of administrative language that headquarters preferred. The severed detonation cord, the improvised splicing, the gambling with insufficient explosives, none of that would appear in the official record. But McNiece remembered the weight of the primer caps in his hands, the uncertainty about whether his field repairs would hold, the growing sound of tank tracks as German armor approached the crossing. He remembered the moment when the splice connection held, The blast that dropped tons of stone into the canal, and the silence that followed successful demolition. Most of all, he remembered the choice: follow procedures that couldn't work, or improvise something that might kill him. Combat engineering reduced to its essential elements: reading the ground, calculating risks, and hoping your repairs held long enough to matter. "Any equipment losses?" Morrison asked. "Some detonation cord damaged during the drop," McNiece replied. "But recoverable." The lieutenant made another note, probably calculating replacement costs and supply requirements. McNiece fingered the spliced cord, its copper strands twisted together with field expedience and stubborn determination. Damaged, but recoverable. An accurate description of most combat operations and most combat soldiers. Collins appeared in the doorway, his injured arm properly immobilized by a medic who'd caught up with the scattered paratroopers. The sergeant looked older than his 23 years, aged by responsibility and the kind of decisions that left permanent marks on memory. "Word from battalion," Collins reported. "German armor column diverted south after the bridge went down. Bought us at least 6 hours to consolidate positions. 6 hours. In combat terms, that was enough time to reorganize scattered units, establish defensive positions, and prepare for the next crisis." The bridge demolition at Pont du Phare had traded stone and steel for time, the most valuable commodity in any military operation. But McNiece knew the real cost wasn't measured in destroyed infrastructure or delayed enemy movements. It was carried in the hands that had spliced detonation cord under fire, the memory of charges that might not fire, and the knowledge that success had balanced on improvised connections and desperate timing. The severed wire around his wrist had become something different during the morning's action. Not just damaged equipment, but a reminder of how quickly plans fell apart and how much depended on field repairs and stubborn determination. Every demolition mission carried that lesson, but few demonstrated it with such brutal clarity. Morrison finished his notes and disappeared back into the chaos of battalion coordination. Collins settled against the wall beside Riggs, both men showing the particular exhaustion that followed successful combat operations, relief mixed with the growing awareness of how close things had come to disaster. McNiece studied the spliced detonation cord in the fading afternoon light. The repair was holding, copper strands twisted together with enough strength to carry electrical current across the gap created by enemy shrapnel. Damaged but functional, improvised but reliable, a perfect metaphor for airborne operations and the men who conducted them. The cord would stay with him for the rest of the war, a reminder that sometimes the line between success and failure was as thin as spliced wire, and sometimes that was enough. 40 years later, Jake McNiece sat on his Oklahoma porch, watching freight trains cross the steel bridge that carried the Santa Fe line over the Canadian River. The sound of wheels on metal still brought back memories of Norman stone collapsing into dark water, the weight of primer caps in muddy hands, and the splice of detonation cord that had held when everything else failed. The official history of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment described the Pont du Phare bridge demolition in 3 clean sentences. Staff Sergeant McNiece successfully destroyed the target despite equipment difficulties and enemy presence. The delayed German armor advance allowed consolidation of American positions in Sector 7. Mission completed per operational parameters. But McNiece remembered the weight of choice in that Norman farmhouse. The sound of approaching tank tracks and the moment when improvised field splicing became the difference between success and disaster. The severed detonation cord sat in a wooden box in his bedroom, its copper wire darkened by age but still showing the twisted repair that had carried electrical current across a gap measured in heartbeats and desperate hope. His grandson found the cord during a visit, holding the tarnished wire with the casual curiosity of someone born into a world where bridges stood until officially demolished, where wars existed in history books rather than muddy fields, where the distance between success and failure wasn't measured in spliced wire and split-second timing. "What's this, Grandpa?" McNiece took the cord, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the texture of Norman mud and the mechanical precision of primer caps seating against TNT blocks. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that history sometimes balanced on improvised connections, that the difference between heroism and disaster was often nothing more than field repairs holding long enough to matter? "Piece of wire from the war," he said finally. "Broke when I needed it most, so I fixed it." The boy nodded with the easy acceptance of youth, probably imagining neat technical repairs rather than desperate splicing under enemy fire. McNiece didn't correct him. Some truths were too heavy for children, too complicated for clean explanations. The freight train disappeared around a bend, its sound fading into the Oklahoma distance. McNiece had helped build some of these railroad bridges during the post-war construction boom, applying lessons learned in Norman hedgerows to peaceful infrastructure projects. The mathematics were the same: stress calculations, load distributions, structural weak points, but the stakes were measured in efficiency rather than survival. He thought about Private Riggs, who'd returned to his Ohio farm and spent 40 years growing corn without ever mentioning that he'd once crawled through German-occupied countryside with a TNT satchel and infinite faith that his sergeant knew what he was doing. The kid had earned a Bronze Star for the Pont du Phars operation, though the citation described actions that bore little resemblance to the mud and improvisation McNiece remembered. Lieutenant Morrison had made captain by war's end, then colonel during career, eventually retiring to a Veterans Administration desk where he wrote policy manuals that reduced combat complexity to administrative procedures. Morrison's after-action report on the bridge demolition had become a case study in airborne operations, required reading for demolition specialists who would never face the reality of splicing detonation cord under fire. The severed wire told a different story. Messier, more human, weighted with the knowledge that success often depended on repairs that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. McNiece had carried that knowledge through the rest of the war, through Market Garden and the Bulge, through dozens of bridges that fell because someone improvised solutions to problems no training manual anticipated. But the real weight wasn't in the demolished bridges or the delayed enemy columns. It was in the memory of choices made when everything fell apart, the responsibility for men who trusted him to splice broken connections and make desperate gambles pay off. The wire around his wrist during that Norman morning had become a reminder that leadership often reduced to improvisation, disguised as confidence. His grandson had moved on to other interests, leaving McNiece alone with the detonation cord and the sound of distant traffic crossing bridges built to last. The wire felt lighter now, its copper strands worn smooth by decades of handling, but it still carried the weight of that June morning when German tanks had approached a crossing that absolutely had to fall. The story would outlive him, he supposed, passed down through family memories and regimental histories, probably growing cleaner and more heroic with each telling. The severed detonation cord would become a symbol rather than a reminder, its improvised repair transformed into evidence of technical brilliance rather than desperate field expedient. But the wire itself would remember the truth, that sometimes the distance between disaster and success was measured in twisted copper strands, that courage often looked like stubbornness from the inside, and that the most important bridges were the ones you built between impossible orders and the men depending on you to find solutions that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The freight train's whistle echoed across the Oklahoma plains, calling to mind the sound of steel giving way under explosive force, the crash of stone falling into Norman water, and the silence that followed successful demolition. McNiece wrapped the detonation cord around his fingers one more time, feeling its familiar weight, carrying forward the memory of morning light on spliced wire, and the knowledge that some repairs held longer than anyone had a right to expect. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.